Okay, good morning, afternoon, or night from the East Coast of America. Thank you for being here today. I'm excited to have you here to participate in the inaugural seminar offering of the Critical, Philosophical, and Psychoanalytic Institute for Mathematics Education. A brief word on the Institute. The fellows, scholars, and adjuncts of CPPI organized the Institute as a collective effort in response to many converging disillusionments we experienced in the field, whether those disillusionments involved methodological, philosophical, theoretical, epistemological, or ethical issues, or even notions of objectivity itself. Thus, the Institute is a research as activism project. Today's talk will hopefully establish our relationship with the rest of the field as it's complicated. Indeed, that is our goal, to be suspicious of nice and digestible nuggets of knowledge production, instead championing the Hegelian spirit of working on it through this new institution. As such, I do not posit to have any answers for you, but rather hopefully to provoke more questions. Questions that might reveal the fantasy screen of the field of mathematics education. That is, in short, the goal of CPPI and our associated peer-reviewed journal, the Journal for Theoretical and Marginal Mathematics Education. One of the purposes of CPPI is to reinvigorate the role of the public intellectual and the debate space within the field. The Institute's members all share a devotion to some things that may seem like a lost art in the modern era of education research. Philosophy as method and inquiry, speculative research, critique of published research as research in itself, public seminars and intellectual engagement, a general rejection of objectivity and myths of empiricism, and its derivatives such as usefulness. We share a dream of a future where the field of mathematics education has entered an era of radical subjectivity, philosophical investigations, speculative research, and a centering of critique of mathematics and education. To support this dream, we hold these public seminars on roughly a bi-monthly basis, so every 2 months. And more information on upcoming events can be found on our website, CPPI.ME, and click on events. We also publish the peer-reviewed academic journal I just mentioned, what we refer to as JTM. The first issue of the journal will be released late next year, and there is still time to make submissions for consideration for the first issue. The deadline is December 15th of this year. There is more information, including a call for papers, on our website, and you just click on journal instead of on events. Many of you here in attendance today may share the interests of the Institute, and so I would urge you to send in submissions that you may have previously thought, there's no home for this anywhere. There's no journal where this fits. We have a spectacular set of manuscripts under review right now for the first issue. Some are full-length theoretical papers, some are play scripts, you heard me right, play scripts, and some are poems. We are also expecting at least one invited art piece to appear in the first issue. The CFP on the journal's webpage will give you more details on how JTM is different and intentionally built around the philosophical underpinnings that formed the Institute. So about today, the talk will last for about 50 minutes, and then we will open up the floor for responses and discussion from all of you. I'm hoping that the talk will prompt comments and critiques from you. We want you to participate. I will moderate the discussion here on Zoom after I'm done speaking, presenting the paper. And you are encouraged to reflect on the talk during the discussion section and add any responses you might feel comfortable doing. As I already said, additionally, a copy of this paper is available on the Institute's website under the events section. We already have 3 more confirmed seminars in the works to be announced soon. One actually I'm ready to announce today by our fellow Tio Savage, who is here, another Hegel fan, as am I. The details on Tio's talk, Introduction to Critical Mathematics, The Sound of Time, went live on our website last night, and you can begin registering for that now. It will be held in January. Also in 2022, we will have another talk by fellow David Bowers and Mark Wolfmeyer, they are both here today, I believe, so it's very good to see both of you. More information on David's and Mark's talks will be available later. So with that, I think we are ready to begin. I will start with a quote from Lacan's Seminar 3 on the Psychoses. Certainty is the rarest of things for the normal subject. Lacan prefers the plural form of psychosis, instead calling them psychoses, saying, why should we deny ourselves the luxury of the term? Of course, there is more than one. Today's talk is to examine how mathematics with a capital M, that which is practiced by mathematicians and promulgated by the rest of the field of mathematics education, teachers and researchers alike, as an exemplar, aspirational, and immaculate goal, is itself a form of psychosis, a psychosis promulgated through the ideology of mathematics education, reproduced by the institution of the school, and executed for the sake of capitalism. It is a superegoic attempt to impose order and certainty onto an otherwise traumatic realization of the lacking in completeness in ourselves and the inexistence of even cosmic indifference in the universe. It leads to contradictions in the labor of mathematics education, contradictions which the field is designed to disavow through political and structural distractions, contradictions that unfortunately then have no choice but to end up being repressed by its actors, and this is by design. The ideology of mathematics education serves thus as the most egregious technology and agent of capitalism vis-a-vis the school credit system and the teacher education system. This is how the cycle of human labor in the teaching profession continues to functionally operate. Surely then, it must be of broad interest to our field to understand this enormous ontological failure. The title of this talk may surprise you. Mathematicians are psychotics, you may ask? A friend of mine who is here today, a friend of mine responded to the announcement with, wow, a lecture that reduces my life's work to a mental illness. Who could resist? I assure you, the purpose of this talk today is not to denigrate the work of mathematicians, but rather to formulate an argument that has important implications for the work of mathematics education researchers. Psychoanalysis continues to be a controversial theoretical position to take, especially since it has suffered a mass exodus from the 1970s, roughly the 1970s through today. Yet I believe we are seeing new life breathed into psychoanalysis in more recent years. Even in the field of mathematics education, we have seen cutting-edge researchers, some of whom are here today, develop the psychoanalytic perspective of mathematics education. In many cases, the application of psychoanalysis to mathematics education has taken as its analysand aspects such as assessment, the institution of the school, the curriculum of the school, and so forth. The purpose of my lecture today is to extend the application of psychoanalysis in the field of mathematics education to include mathematics with a capital M, or what we might sometimes call the mathematics itself, which is often the implicit backstop of the research that we in this field perform. Psychoanalysis is a science that recognizes the unconscious as existing, It is thus a science that understands itself through its own limits. As such, psychoanalysis can lead to very different research results than more traditional paradigms. Let's do some background on Lacan. I'm glad to see some faces here today who might not have had prior experience with psychoanalysis. I will begin by giving some background on psychoanalysis and particularly Lacanian psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis was sort of the first psychiatry that existed before modern psychoactive medicines. The work of early pioneers, such as Sigmund Freud, is well known in popular discourse, although I would argue that is widely misunderstood by those who don't study it professionally. To make this misunderstanding of psychoanalysis even worse, the work of Jacques Lacan, the French psychoanalyst, and he lived in the early part of the 1900s. So he died in 1981, I believe. But his work is notoriously difficult to understand. Much of his published work are transcriptions of his yearly seminars that would run from academic year calendars. Today's talk will be based primarily on seminars 3 and 20. Seminar 3, which was delivered during the academic year 1955 to 1956, covered the topic of the psychoses. Seminar 20, which was delivered during the academic year 1972 to 1973, covers the topics of feminine sexuality and the limits of love and knowledge. In psychoanalysis, knowledge and sexuality are intricately connected. Deborah Britzman, the influential education researcher and psychoanalyst, famously said, "Sexuality is the root of intellectual curiosity." So while keeping within the window of time we have allotted for this talk, I want to spend some time doing definitions of key concepts for those here today who may not have had previous experience with Lacanian theory. I will read a couple of definitions here from the Lacanian Encyclopedia, combined with some of my own elaborations. The first concept that you'll need to understand is that of the big other, also written other with a capital O, or l'autre in French, in that case with a capital A. You saw this term in the title of the talk. In the French, the letter A is used instead of O. So when writing in what's called Lacanian algebra, we typically use A, capital A and lowercase a, and when we are speaking or writing about it in English discourse, we typically use the words big other and small other, or other with a capital O and other with a lowercase o. The big other should be understood in relation to the small o other. The little other is the other who is not in fact other, but rather a reflection or projection of the ego. It is simultaneously the counterpart and the specular image. The little other is inscribed in the imaginary order as both the counterpart and the specular image. One form that the little other takes is in what Lacan calls object small a, or objet petit a, or just objet a, which is what I usually call it, is objet a. That's just the French. These are the things, the objects of our desire, if you will, that we project our ego onto as a source of our happiness. If only we attain objet a, then we will be complete. Objet a promises to fill the incompleteness inside us by allowing us to become our ideal selves, whatever that may be. This is how consumer culture within capitalism works. The big other, by contrast, other with a capital O, or l'autre with a capital A, is by contrast a little bit more abstract. It designates radical alterity, an otherness which transcends the illusory otherness of the imaginary, because it cannot be assimilated through identification. Lacan equates the big other with language and the law, and hence the big other is inscribed in the symbolic order. Indeed, the big other is the symbolic order insofar as it is particularized for each subject. That is why mathematics is the big other, Loutra with a capital A. I bet I would love to find a radical constructivist who would disagree with me on that. Thus, the other is both another subject in its radical alterity and unassimilable uniqueness, and also the symbolic order which mediates the relationship with that subject. The big other, however, is where capital M, mathematics, the mathematics itself, we sometimes call it in our field, is located. I will explore that concept more in the talk today. It's a key component of my argument. However, a crucial property of the big other as a complete form is that it does not exist. Language and law can both be reduced to meaning and thus to nothingness. This is because meaning is instituted through language in a chain of signifiers, but there is always one missing. Lacan says a signifier is nothing more than a subject for another signifier, and thus there can always be a signifier missing from the chain, rendering the entire chain void of any ontological substance. This incompleteness is what Lacan calls lack, the lack in the big other. As infants, we search for the big other, and then we find that it does not exist. This represents castration. This can also be seen in the Hegelian notion of the deontological status of the absolute. In its constitution as the totality of all being, it is always already imbued with a crack. Its ontology is precisely deontological. The next term we will need is jouissance, loosely translated into English as enjoyment or pleasure. The French term is much more dynamic in its meaning, but for the purposes of this talk, it suffices to think of jouissance and enjoyment / pleasure as basically the same thing. Jouissance is an imperative in Lacanian theory. We must enjoy. Jouissance grounds us in our experience, and without it, we would be relegated to the level of the purely abstract. Lacan uses the term in different ways, a couple of which I will be using today, but it suffices to understand the difference between phallic jouissance and the other's jouissance, which is feminine jouissance. Phallic or masculine jouissance is teleological enjoyment, that which exists for its own purpose. The other's jouissance is distributed, developing. You can think of it as not situated in a single person and defined by an incomplete state of emergence, what might be called that which arises, versus the phallic jouissance, which could by parallel be called that which is. Next, we must see what Lacan defines as the psychoses. Psychoses as a psychic phenomenon is the emergence in reality of an enormous meaning that has the appearance of being nothing at all, insofar as it cannot be tied to anything, since it has never entered into the system of symbolization. But under certain conditions, it can thread the entire edifice. That's his definition from Seminar 3. What are we to make of this definition? It is necessary here to tease apart the different dimensions of mathematics as we experience it. The mental phenomenon of the concepts, such as number, angle, and so forth, and the meaning that we assign to them. This is precisely what the radical constructivists have attempted to do, although I would say that they have neglected to recognize the psychic aspects of mind as well, such as the unconscious and the logic of the signifier, so that their project remains restricted to the study of the mental constructs themselves as subjective artifacts that can hopefully be interpreted but never actually understood by researchers. The psychoanalytic project instead is concerned with the task of understanding how these hypothetical mental constructs get assigned meaning in the unconscious. What is the origin of this meaning? From whence comes its authority? And what impacts this overlooked meaning and authority have in an invisible way when engaged in tasks such as teaching, learning, and studying mathematics? The argument I give you today is precisely that the authority of mathematics is assigned the universal position, the position of the big other, and that this constitutes a psychotic position, which then bleeds over into the processes of the field of mathematics education, processes which go unchecked and uncritiqued apropos psychosis. Lastly, I want to define the question che vuoi, which is Italian for what do you want, meaning what do you want from me? This is a dialectic that Lacan uses to define desire because one's desire is always the other's desire. Jouissance comes from secretly asking that question to someone else inside your own head. Who is this directed to by mathematicians? I will argue today that it is addressed to the big other, capital M mathematics. Thus, the title of the talk captures the psychotic mathematician question. What does the big other want? So let's discuss my argument for today. By placing mathematics in the position of the big other, mathematicians effectively take up a psychotic position in doing mathematics. The authority of the big other is taken as a given. This psychotic position misreads the big other, for example, leading to conclusions such as mathematics exists, when in fact we have no reason to know that. We certainly believe that it does, but this is different than knowledge. Just ask any radical constructivist. We believe that mathematics exists because it allows us to control our environment, which we get great enjoyment out of doing. I might even go a step farther here, recalling Lacan's maxim that there is no other to the other. That is, there is no structure that confers meaning onto the big other. So it has no other to itself. But this might also be exactly what mathematicians do when considering mathematics as the other of the other and the universe as the other. Mathematics in this formulation confers meaning onto the universe. And I think that that's what we see a lot of times in popular discourse. Why do we get enjoyment out of controlling the universe through mathematics, effectively using mathematics as a procreational proxy? I believe it is because, as Lacan famously says in Seminar 20, there is no sexual relationship. This realization is traumatic for us, so we do everything to repress it. In its place, we have produced mathematics, quite literally as a product of sexuality, to make up for this fact, that there is no sexual relationship. Mathematics, outside of its psychotic structure, is something we have made up to universally negate the inexistence of the sexual relationship. Of course, this Lacanian maxim is not actually negated through mathematics, we only repress it, which is why we must rely on psychoanalysis to recover it from the depths of the unconscious. There are several contradictions we can recover from the unconscious through the use of psychoanalysis. Many of these are produced by the psychology we use to study mathematics and its education. But if we forget psychoanalysis, we reify many myths of objectivity that even the radical constructivists have a complicated relationship with, such as objective model building in the name of reconstructive productive research. Lacan calls such a contradiction the, quote, myth of immediate experience. We in the psychoanalytic project are rather interested in something behind the model, behind the immediate experience, whatever it is that conditions it. And it should be very hard to find this because the psychotic position of mathematics is instituted in all three Lacanian realms, the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. In the imaginary, the psychotic position of mathematics produces the images of what we experience as, quote, mathematics in the real world, an issue I will return to later when I discuss the epistemological implications for my argument today. In the symbolic, we experience mathematics as always already being an organized language, one to which we have always already ascribed authority. And in the real, the psychotic position of mathematics perhaps becomes the most cogent. The real is that anxiety, that traumatic impossibility that is always already there and simultaneously emerging. It is the sinking feeling in your chest. The authority of mathematics is the most eminent from this place. As a procreational proxy, exploding onto the quanta of space-time, and as such, because we avoid the real at all costs in our human experience, the imaginary and symbolic manifestations of the mathematics psychosis are allowed to, and indeed encouraged to, flourish. Let me read an excerpt from Lacan's Seminar 3 from page 31, which I would like for you to hear now in the context of mathematics. What is normally called the content is what I would prefer to call the psychotic statement. You think you are dealing with someone who is communicating with you because he speaks the same language as you. And then what he is saying is so understandable that you get the feeling, particularly if you are a psychoanalyst, that here is someone who has penetrated in a more profound way than is given to the common lot of mortals, has penetrated into the very mechanism of the system of the unconscious. Such a person might say, enlightenment rarely given to mortals has been given to me. In both the intrapersonal experience of mathematics, success and failure, and in mathematics' capacity as social signifier, we see evidence of this unconscious effect. Ultimate authority in the universe lies with either God or mathematics. Of course, the authority of mathematics is then inscribed onto God, and so the problem of such a potential duality is reducible to the existence of one or the other. This authority is not questioned, and further, it drives all of mathematics education. This leads to contradictions in what we ask children to do apropos mathematics in school. Are we not addressing the universe in our mathematical discourse? We assume it is discourse full of meaning, and yet we have no idea what we are saying. It is, in fact, empty discourse. The duality of full and empty meaning is the mark of delusion, according to Lacan. And where is this more evident than in the work of the mathematics teacher and their class of students, whether this is occurring at the school or the university level? Let me demonstrate a contradiction that this produces. If mathematics is not a psychotic position, then it must be out there in the symbolic register. A characteristic of mathematics in the symbolic is that there is no plagiarism because there is no property. One cannot plagiarize an idea because it never belonged to the original author in the first place. Now, crucially, here is a reversal. Mathematics, because of its psychotic nature, is codified as belonging to the symbolic, to the big other. We observe this in mathematics classes at both the school and university levels by giving assessments where the goal of the students is to individually reproduce the same answers, those which the teacher has already prepared on her answer key. But then this conflicts with, for example, the modus operandi of the radical constructivist project, that mathematics is not out there and that such assessment yielding the same results must be coincidental. Now, let me step back and ask, are we so to blame for this? Quite the contrary. For Lacan, as soon as we speak, the big other is there. This occurs so early in our development that we cannot avoid it. The problem arises in how we ascribe meaning to the big other, a problem that has been continuously submerged in late capitalism so that consumption can be accelerated and innovated. Mathematics is a key culprit in this mechanism. Mathematicians are equally unaware of this. They simply speak to you about something that has spoken to them. Indeed, mathematics teachers in school do precisely the same thing. Lacan reveals that this is the structure of paranoia, which is one of the foundations of psychosis. However, the big other is there nonetheless. I am reading from page 40 of seminar 3 now. The distinction between the other with a big O, that is the other insofar as it is not known, and the other with a small o, that is the other who is me, the source of all knowledge, I would add as the constructivists would have it. The distinction is fundamental. It is in this gap, in this angle opened up between these two relations, the big other and the small other, that the entire dialectic of delusion has to be situated. Indeed, this is precisely how I'm situating my argument against the pervasive theoretical perspectives of our field. Mathematics goes beyond a simple neurosis of which we all suffer in some form, because there is fantasy beyond the symbolic, precisely wherein the authority of mathematics and its symbols lies. Thus, whilst the content of mathematics comes from within us, the meaning and authority we ascribe to it comes from without. This is why mathematics is a psychosis. The paradox of mathematics that its psychosis reveals is that we first have to recognize it in order to subject ourselves to it vis-a-vis the universe in which we situate our experience. Through mathematics education, we recognize mathematics first, rather than recognizing ourselves as subjects of it, qua its psychotic authority. But why is psychosis a problem at all? Aren't we just speaking our own mathematics? Well, the distinction here is the issue of alienation. I will explain this more next through a discussion of the epistemological implications of my discourse thus far. So what might this mathematical episteme look like? Well, perhaps the fetish of discovering an empirical understanding qua the psychotic position of mathematics is a fetish instantiated by our desire to understand our existence as beheld by the big other. If we could only know why we know things, we would be closer to knowing how the big other sees us. In other words, the psychotic position of mathematics allows us to ask the big other what it wants. That is the title of today's talk, Que veut l'autre? What does the big other want? I argue that we find the hint hiding in the persistent question, why is mathematics so effective in the natural sciences in ordering our world? Excuse me. Our jouissance of this control of our environment in and for itself is not sufficient to answer this question. Otherwise, none of you would be here today and I would not have a topic for this talk. There must be something in the external natural reality that allows our psychotic construction of the authority of mathematics to proceed on a mass level. Okay, what about ostensible observances we make of mathematics in nature? Let us pursue this argument. Certainly, there are observances we make of mathematics existing in nature. Indeed, it would make me look rather delusional myself to try to convince you otherwise. But they do deserve a bit more nuanced devotion of our attention today. It is crucial here to not make the jump and assign authority to the mathematics as we see it. That would be reverting to the psychotic position, placing mathematics in the big other, which, let me remind you, doesn't exist. Let me explain how, then, it would ever be possible for us to see mathematics in the world around us and subsequently use it to order and structure our world. Consider a pine cone, which here in North America at least, and I'm not sure about other places in the world, but a pine cone has nodules arranged on it following the Fibonacci sequence. Flowers have the same property in their petal arrangements. These patterns' recognition in the symbolic as such is an imposition of our minds. Imagine the world with no humans. The pine cone would probably look the same as it does now. The pattern of its nodules would be the same regardless of our observation and identification of it as an instance of the Fibonacci numbers. But is the pine tree aware of this? It is merely the most efficient packaging for its biological purposes. Does the tree know that it has organized something regarding the Fibonacci numbers? Can the tree count or add or understand what a sequence is? No. The symbolic has exploded all over reality. It is waiting there, ready for us to look at it. Yet what is actually happening when the pine cone is identified as having a Fibonacci arrangement of nodules, except that the observer is imposing that mathematical meaning onto a proxy-laden entanglement he is having with the symbolic. The pine cone for itself is not a pine cone. The observer recognizes it as a pine cone only through his symbolic determination of it. The pine cone for itself is indifferent to the arrangement of its nodules. The Fibonacci determination is simply for us. Thus, we reflexively assign a determination onto mathematics that it is, quote, unreasonably effective in the natural sciences. Did the natural patterns, such as the pine cone, exist before Fibonacci developed the sequence? Perhaps he developed his sequence using the numbers which had been themselves developed in response to interpreting nature, namely interpreting reality through the lens of the symbolic, and then realized in an epiphany that there were these lucky instances of the pattern existing in reality. That is, the development of new mathematics is simply our best attempt to interpret reality through our crippling access to the symbolic, a reality which, without its transcendental component, leaves us with a symbolic view of all that remains, a, quote, inconsistent mess of the real, to use a Zizek'ian phrase. The fact that we have naturally occurring instances of this Fibonacci sequence only shows us that we have remained in a hermeneutic loop. The pine tree needed to genetically manipulate itself when producing pine cones to make its offspring the most successful, which resulted in a clustering of the nodules in such a way that maximized this biological necessity. Mathematics has merely identified itself as a circular projection of our impossible attempt to circumvent the necessity of a transcendental or deontological kernel in understanding nature's totality. Indeed, the positive reality of the pine cone is simply organized in such a way that the Fibonacci symbolic can emerge out of it. Yet we are unable to reconcile this symbolic phenomenon because of that proto-deontological crack of impossibility. If our minds had different symbolic sensibilities in, say, some alternate universe where we saw the world as dogs, then the symbolic of the pine cone would manifest differently. This is the deontological crack. The pine cone, as we symbolically determine it, fails to be what it is. For Zizek, as it was for Hegel, there is some objective reality out there where objects exist, except that it is always already imbued with impossibility and incompleteness, a, quote, tension between its assertion of its own existence and that which it yearns to be. Thus, our original question becomes an impossible question to answer. Why is mathematics so unreasonably effective in the natural sciences? Our logic fractures on the matter because we perceive mathematics to be epistemologically complete, but this directly contradicts the Hegelian crack that must be there. Thus, mathematics cannot be merely what it is because it must become what it is through our instantiations. And indeed, that is the entire work of mathematicians. Thus, mathematics is so unreasonably effective because it reflects our intentional epistemological projections of organization onto our entanglements with the symbolic. But our understanding of this contingency that mathematics is, quote, becoming rather than is, fails because we attempt to close the positive reality as if the proto-deontological crack is not there. Yet any attempts to locate it will ultimately not matter because it is just past the horizon limit of the fantasy screen of the mind. The crack is paradoxically the only object to which we have direct unmediated access in order to verify its existence. But verifying that would be, traumatic. So everything else in the positive reality is strictly accessed by proxy, simply reaffirming the crack, which is why we never see it. The discourse I have offered today is not without direct consequence, especially for mathematics education. Let me reframe the ideas I have presented thus far within the context of mathematics education, which most of us here today work within, especially apropos the psychotic position's implications for constructivism and its classically oriented counterpart, innativism. I think Chomsky. Let me explain. The work of mathematics teachers is to teach a psychotic position to children, apropos mathematics, children who have no contextual basis for understanding it as such. Indeed, in most cases, neither do the teachers. They simply reproduce the exclusionary system they themselves were traumatically subjected to. The role of school is thus to codify the psychosis, leading to further impacts of the alienating power of mathematics and its social signification as such. Construction of concepts implies that there is some risk for the person undertaking it. He may not succeed. In particular, if that person's support system, such as economic and social, think students, isn't robust enough to support that person through the process of education, then that person may never believe that they have the ability to be successful in undertaking the constructive process. Consider a typical scene in the day of a mathematics teacher. The students struggle. They see the teacher as the math god who knows everything. And in fact, the teacher knows mathematics for them. That is, in place of their knowing. The teacher works through the students' content struggles. Maybe they have a moment of salient clarity, an aha moment, a light bulb goes off. Maybe they feel like they have unlocked some power through their mathematical progress. Maybe it is only slight, like finally understanding how to get common denominators to add fractions together. Maybe they feel empowered for that special moment, and maybe even for a week or two. But then inevitably the next difficulty comes, and perhaps it is not related to their ability to understand the concept, but some failure of their support system, economic, social, or both. All of their struggle and labor is still done to the end of a test grade, a score, an A on a report card. And for what? Whither this grade one has worked so hard to achieve? This leaves us stranded at a traumatic impasse of the students and the teachers' labor. Why has all of this snowballed out of control? Perhaps it is due to the constructivist notion that some people have the mathematics and some people don't. I'm going to clarify that. The fact that those without it can get it if they just work on it is too much. It quickly becomes unbearable because of the social signification of mathematics qua its psychosis. On the other side of this argument, if students believed they had innate structures, say the same ones as the math teacher, to learn mathematics, what different outcome would result? This is a cultural problem because of all the parents who say, I can't do math. And in fact, they avoid mathematics and their own failed relationship with math by pushing it onto their children. My argument here is based on the fact that modern Western culture is a meritocracy, and thus to reproduce itself relies on training children that their work produces stratified results depending on how hard they work. Thus, this mathematical ideology obscures the economic and social components of mathematics and keeps us focused on the meritocratic fetish of mathematics content mastery. The meritocratic fetish is a fetish which crucially only includes some people, those who believe that it applies to them. Those who believe that they are, quote, in the fetish. Doing away with constructivism and instead centering innateness necessarily disavows that some have it and some don't, while also avoiding the contradiction of mathematical labor. That mathematics is the dividing line between manual and intellectual labor. That's a phrase from Sohn Rathel. Indeed, the ideology of mathematics as the socially signifying border between intellectual and manual labor structurally reproduces the bifurcation of labor into manual and intellectual as an unavoidable consequence of its self-reproduction. And I just would say we see this in school outcomes. So finally, the contradictions and conclusions that I leave you with. In my discourse today, I have attempted to reveal several contradictions for you. The first is the psychotic position of mathematics, one which simultaneously is reproduced and denied by the entire spectrum of mathematics education epistemologies. The primary consequence of this is that this psychosis is codified by schools and universities and taught to students in the form of classes, assessments, and through the use of social signification. Even going further, the social signification of mathematics is psychotically produced as a structure of alienation within late capitalism for the purposes of stratifying society based on the extent to which one is able to voluntarily adopt a psychosis for himself, thus reproducing the system of late capitalism whilst remaining blissfully ignorant of its own inherent contradictions and the teacher's contribution to their reproduction. The second contradiction I attempted to reveal for you today in my discourse is the impasse of the individual construction of mathematical knowledge and the innateness position, a dichotomy which has historically been constructed as ontological in nature, but where the psychotic position of mathematics acts as a third kind and indeed frames the constructivist and innativist divide as two symptoms of the psychosis I described for you today. Finally, we see evidence of all of the above in the meritocratic fetish of mathematics education, a fetish which itself reproduces the psychotic position of mathematics by further acting as an exclusionary agent. I avoid going into other symptoms created therein, such as implications for social justice studies or equity research, although there are lots of them to explore, as I will leave that for another day. It suffices today if you would take away an initial, even if fraught, understanding of the psychotic position of mathematics. I would ask you from this new position to consider the question, what is the point of all this mathematics education? Then again, it might be more appropriate instead to consider the question, what does mathematics, as the big other, want from me? Thank you. We will now open the seminar for discussion. Bring this down here. Okay, I was readjusting screens. Got some chats in the chat box. I have to say the it's complicated relationship, that was David's phrase that he came up with. Any comments, questions, or thoughts? Roberto, yes. Oh, wait a minute. Thank you, Cheryl. I turned that off and I forgot to turn it back on. Okay, everybody can unmute themselves now. Very sorry about that.
Yes. Yes. Okay.
But now, what will I do in my next Monday morning class?
So es, yeah.
Alexander, I believe that was the question, right?
I didn't hear it. I'm sorry.
He asked what he was going to do in his next Monday's class.
Well, I find it, I'm sort of a pessimist with regard to capitalism. I don't think that we're ever going to escape it. I think we will just run it into the ground until we end up in some kind of a feudal state. So I'm perfectly happy critiquing it while we're all sinking with the ship. So as for now, I mean, I work in teacher licensure. My job is licensing new teachers. And what I do is try to at least make them aware of the contradictions of the job they're signing up for. Because if I can give them that sort of like perspective, and then they go out into the field and start teaching, then maybe after a while we'll reach some critical mass of things like that. But I don't teach any math content anymore. Now, I will say that the work of the labor of mathematicians is, should remain the same. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that, but I'm saying as mathematics education researchers, we sort of take a lot of that for granted and don't question the authority of it. And then we do all of these socially reproductive things like teaching in schools that we don't actually know what we're doing. We don't actually see what we're doing in that process. But the mathematics content itself is different than that. My critique is purely in mathematics education. I've got some comments here.
Yeah, I just put a question in.
Hi, Tia.
And it's basically, hi. I don't really know the term the big other, and I was curious how it relates to Geist and Geist's desire to know itself, which in my work I call the recognition desire that we sort of have, to recognize and know each other. And so I'm curious, like, to take your question literally, what is the desire of the big other, right? I'm curious how that relates to desire or Geist.
Well, I think, and I know that you and I sort of read Hegel a little bit differently, but
for sure.
I would say that my answer to that question is like, Geist is like one of the sort of pieces of the formula of the absolute. And so I see that as, in keeping with like Hegelian monism, I see that as sort of like, you're looking at, I see Hegel, and obviously Hegel and Lacan are in lots of conversation with each other, but I see them as sort of like looking at the same thing, but one is looking out and one is looking in. So it's almost like inverted standpoints. And so whereas Hegel is more of like, has the monistic view, one of the fundamental sort of points that Lacan makes is that from the very beginnings of our awareness, we are split subjects. When we see ourselves in the mirror and we look at ourselves and we go, that's me. And so there's always this sort of like split or incompleteness that's there in our own recognition of ourselves. And so you have to sort of situate any question like that as having this reflexive counterpart out there somewhere that's looking back at you almost. So I think that they're similar concepts, but maybe one is just, I think maybe Hegel is more of like sees the unification, and Lacan sees the inverse of unification, the split.
Thanks.
But they are obviously very, in lots of conversation with each other. Ana Lucia.
Hi. My question is like, I think philosophy 101, to understand what you're saying. I think many things I still don't understand. And there are many, but I chose like two from memory that I think would help me understand more what you're saying. One is how you use, or how people, philosophers use exist. Like when you say like the big other, which I remind you doesn't exist, what is to exist? And the other one that I wanted to ask is what do you mean by contradiction? Like, and I think the phrase used it was in psychoanalysis, you can unveil a lot of contradictions in, I think that's what you said, in the person's unconscious.
Mm-hmm. So existing, that's a very loaded question. I think it depends on, I think different philosophical traditions use the term exist in different ways. That's sort of like, I'm just thinking about this. That's one of the main sort of breaks in my reading of it, one of the main breaks in the history of philosophy from like going from Kant to Hegel. And so when you get to Hegel, you have existence and inexistence sort of being part of the same concept or encapsulated in the same concept. And so the existence is just sort of that which you are able to be consciously aware of outside of yourself, this totality of all being, including yourself. I'm aware that I'm like here right now. I have a hand, I can touch and feel this remote control. I have some semblance of like awareness of what exists. And my access to that is mediated by my mind. That's it. All I have is my mind to interpret that. But there is some level of faith in that awareness. And that is the extent to which I think we can say things exist. It's this sort of faith, or as Brandon would say, spirit of trust in that existence. I think that Zizek would say a spirit of distrust. But either way, whether you're trusting or distrusting it, you have to sort of recognize the existence of something in order to make it the object of your thought. And so that's sort of how I look at existence.
Can you make that more like concrete for me by
Sure.
using the example of the small O and the big O, like one exists and the other doesn't, right? That you said. So how does that apply to those two?
Mm-hmm.
How are they different? For me, just let me say like my question. I think like there are concrete things which people say they exist, but you can discuss that. But there are abstract things that we create with our minds. So for example, when people say like race doesn't exist, they mean biologically, but it exists because it's a concept that is around in society. So for me, it exists as an abstract concept or social construction. I don't know. So when you say the big O doesn't exist, but didn't he formulate this idea, doesn't it now exist as an idea? And why, and how is it different from the
Oh,
little O?
yeah. I
So
see
what
you're saying.
makes one exist and the other does not? Maybe that's easier to answer.
That's a good question. I mean, so it, I see what you're saying. So the big other exists as an idea. So then why doesn't it exist outside of that idea? I think that I think the answer is largely in terms of logic. So the reason that the big other does not exist is because of what is supposed to be contained or constitute the big other. What constitutes the big other is ultimately reducible to nothing, to meaninglessness, but it still holds in our psychic reality, it holds great ultimate authority. And so it doesn't exist because it's almost like faith in nothing. If you think of it that way. That's my best off the cuff answer. Let's think, JF, I'm just going down my list here.
Okay, hi, sorry, I've lost my cursor. Well, first of all, I just want to say a big thank you for the opportunity, for the talk, for everything you're organizing. I think we all here very enjoyed this very much. Well, I had a comment, and I think it's kind of related to what we just discussed. I'm not a big reader of Lacan, so perhaps you're going to be able to help me here. I think that what he's challenging when he's saying, for example, that the big other, that mathematics doesn't exist, is really in terms of what the concept would be referring to. So he's not challenging the existence of the concept, but of whatever it would be referring to. Because mathematics as a reference is unfinished, because it's in the making, and so on. And one of the questions that I had was in relation with ambiguity. I kind of have the feeling that Lacan as a perspective where language is very transparent, where things are, where naming things and speaking of, and that's also related to origin. So where is mathematics coming from, and who's making it available to whom, and so on. And I was just wondering if maybe there's a possibility to say a little bit more about that, and how maybe some of the questions that he raised comes from his perspective on language and the absence of ambiguity in a certain way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good question. So I think that there are different ways to approach that. My sort of personal take on it, based on my reading and study, is sort of this argument that we produce mathematics out of the same psychic structures of sexuality, that they sort of have the same psychic origins. And I've even argued even stronger than that, that we produce mathematics, a product of those psychic structures. And so I think that, here's the way that I like to formulate it, in sort of a quick way, is that ultimately everything can be either reducible to having meaning or lack of meaning. So something either has meaning or it doesn't. Things like language can be reducible to meaninglessness. So they don't have that. But you can't reduce everything to meaninglessness, because there are some things like sexuality that are beyond meaning. And so we might say that the symbolic and the imaginary parts of mathematics can be reduced to that meaninglessness, but the real part can't. And that's sort of why I say, well, if we have to be able to reduce things to there's a great edited book that I love called Sex and Nothing. If we have to be able to reduce everything to sex and nothing, and obviously there's some part of mathematics that does function in structuring, acting as a procreational proxy in the world, then there has to be some part of it that is sexual in nature, or at least sexual in its origins. That's the way I approach that. I don't know if that answers your question or not. Roberta, oh gosh, I've got some chat boxes here. Roberta.
Yes. No, I think that, excuse me. Just a minute. Perhaps a way of nullifying everything you said would be to ask you to translate and explain Lacan to people who don't know him. I think that this is impossible. If you enter this way, I think that most of what you said will be lost. I look at it in the following way. You have said very interesting, important, and deep things for us. And I am looking to the future to be able to decipher everything you said, because many things are very new to us, very interesting. So I say, if people are curious enough about what they have heard, then they should try to look at Lacan and try to understand him. And the way to look at it is just the same way that you look at a new piece of mathematics. Yeah. You have to read it, willing to understand and willing to make sense of it and apply it elsewhere. Otherwise, if you hope to have a translation of Lacan, Hegel, or even Marx to common sense, you lose the whole thing, the whole discourse they have said, they have made. About existence, we may recall that for Hegel, existence is the reflection in itself and in something else, in sich and in etwas. Pegasus does not have this kind of reflection. In the same way, the big other does not have this kind of reflection. If we try to say more than this, I think that we get lost. So if it's important, if you feel that this that he has said shakes you, pick up Lacan and Hegel and study it as you study mathematics.
I like that. And very good advice. Very good advice.
Yeah, thank you. I'll do that.
I'm catching up in the chat. That's a lot easier. I do appreciate that the hegemony of natural science has a less trained relationship with the divide of intellectual versus hands-on, but capital S science seems similarly acritical in terms of distinguishing meaning thrust upon the universe and meaning inherently present. Yeah, David, I think it's interesting. Obviously, one of the influences on me is that I'm at a polytechnic university where science is everything. Engineering is everything. And so there's that sort of, anyway, I don't know, I was trailing off there, but thank you for that comment. Are there other comments or questions? Roberto, yes.
Well, I did not want to produce silence, but let me then tease you with another question. what is it that these people call mathematics?
Hmm. I asked that in a seminar of math PhD students once, and the answers that I got were very obscure, like almost like they couldn't really explain it, and it just kept, the explanation kept going on and on. I have a degree in physics and a degree in math, and I never really totally could have answered that question myself. Which is why, you know, one of Lacan's sayings is that which doesn't stop being written because we can't understand it, we can't know it. I think that mathematics, what is mathematics, is one of those types of things that doesn't stop being written. Ana Lucia.
I was thinking how, I know that we write a lot, I mean, some people in mathematics education, a few, as compared to the whole, write about how mathematics has this role in, how can I say, as a filter for success is one of the things we say, or as something like a desirable object that if you master it, you're seen as, I don't know, superior somehow. We say that a lot, and that is kind of true. And it is definitely a filter because there's a lot of assessment and things that filter those who cannot do math at the standard that someone creates. So it is true in a sense. It is true in a very concrete sense. But as like, if you think as the whole of the world, the way the world is nowadays, I think this was true, more true a few decades ago. I think the way the world is nowadays, sometimes I stop and think like, who are the desired, like when, not everybody, but like many young people or many people today, when you think like, who would you look upon and what you want to be and who's your desired object of? It is the celebrities, it's people in entertainment, right? And they make a lot of money if this is how you measure success in a capitalist society. So even influencers, YouTubers, things like that I think, wow, this person is so well known and I don't know any of them. And then I see my daughter talking about him, like, okay, is that someone I should know? What has this person done and everything? And then I, with my partially my mathematician mind, I think like, well, there's so many people in my department that I admire so much more and that they do a lot of work and they're not recognized or given merit. And you talked about meritocracy. So I think that this frame of mind that I was falling prey to myself, saying, oh, some people in my department admire. Very few people nowadays do have that, right? So, but I also think that those who achieve a high level of praise in society nowadays, for example, celebrities, if they don't know math, they still have something deep inside, like, even though they don't want that for themselves, they say, I don't know that math. Like they kind of, most people, they feel a little hurt or something like that is lacking. Okay, so I think this was a comment, and my question is like, I wonder how this enterprise of teaching mathematics education, and also the whole assessment enterprise of filtering can sustain itself in this world where actually it is at the same time not really so important. How can it still sustain itself? And one more comment is, like when they say, oh, it's needed for jobs because we need more jobs, we need more people in the sciences and mathematics. It is not true, because if you see the difficulty that people with PhD in mathematics, new PhD students, they have difficulty in finding jobs. So how can they still sustain this life? That's my question.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that I struggle with a lot. And it's sort of like, I was a teacher for a long time, and I'm working on my third terminal degree now. And I've spent a lot of time trying to get to that answer. And now I'm here and I'm thinking, this is not what I thought I was getting into. And I go to schools and I observe teacher candidates teaching. And I just think, what is the point of this? I agree that in looking forward a generation, I do agree that it will become less relevant. But what happens is early in development, because this is what's happening still, I would argue, early in childhood development, like in elementary school, the social signification of mathematics is structurally codified to such a big extent that is the system that students then identify with early in their life. And so so mathematics becomes this like dividing line between success and failure in school. I find that mathematics is still sort of subjected to this neurotic behavior, like it's this like obsessional neurosis about it. We certainly don't see the same thing apropos the humanities. We've heard for years, and some people here in this meeting today have written very critically of the mathematics for all mantra. I'm also critical of it. I don't think that it should be for everybody. We certainly don't hear, literature for all. We just hear mathematics for all, or studio art for all. We're not trying to pump out a bunch of artists. We're just trying to get all these students through mathematics. And so, I think that in a generation, we will see it to be different. But right now, at least in my daily work, I still face parent anxiety, at school administrator anxiety, teacher anxiety. Everybody's anxious about math. And so, yeah, I've had students who have just given up. When I was a teacher, I remember I had students who have just given up at mathematics because they were convinced that they were going to be a YouTube sensation. And that's all they wanted, or TikTok sensation. And that's all they wanted to do. And I finally had to say, okay, fine, you live your life. I cannot try to, function in this system and convince you of something that I don't believe myself, that you should do this, mathematics. But that's still sort of the system that we live within socially. And it is, at least here in the US, it is like the most contentious part of getting a high school diploma is getting your verified math credits and all of that kind of thing. So, we have so many remediation paths for mathematics in high school here. None of that attention or time or faculty or anything is given to any other field, just mathematics. So as far as I can see, yeah, I agree that it's becoming less relevant. Maybe in a generation will be there, but as it is right now, it is still quite an obsessional neurosis that we are facing. So, I have lots of chats. Let me just glance at these really fast. Great stuff in the chat, everybody. Thank you for that. And I am aware of the time. We're ending at 12:30. So if there's any other questions that anybody wants to say out loud or comments, now would be the time. I'm glad to see my colleague Aiden here. Aiden is doing a PhD in mathematics, and I think in something geometry. I can't remember exactly what it is that you do, but Aiden is an old friend. Is Wikipedia also the big other? I don't think so. Maybe it is a semblance of the big other. that was directed at Iben. I hope I'm saying that correctly. Algebraic geometry, yeah, and coding theory, yes. I'll just give a little bit of quiet time. People can collect any last thoughts. I appreciate everybody being here so much. David, yes, thank you. Good. And like I said, the recording of this will be up later, and everybody on the mailing list for today's event will get an alert about that. Please feel free to send it to anybody that you'd like. And then we will look forward to seeing you at future seminars. The next one is Tio Savage's in January. And you saw Tio speaking a little bit ago. And then we'll have David Bowers later in the spring, and also Mark Wolfmeyer as well. Those are the ones that we're just working on right now, but this will become a regular offering of the Institute. So thank you so much. I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of your day or your evening, wherever you are in the world. And thank you again.